Hello and welcome to the show. This episode, we're diving into one of the most significant, in my view, but often overlooked issues in economics, public debt. Now, to some it may sound abstract, but it goes right to the heart of issues of cost of living, taxes, and the future of the economy, in my view. So this is a conversation that I had on the latest Australian Taxpayers Alliance live stream that I've been doing with John Humphreys on Thursday night. John and I spoke with Professor Sinclair Davidson, and we explored whether governments are giving us the full picture on the budget and whether Australia is quietly sleepwalking into a more dangerous fiscal position. So we talk about fiscal illusion, off-budget spending, and why debt may be less under control than it appears, or as the government would claim it is. And we ask an important question: have we lost the instinct that we once had to worry about deficits and debt? And what does that mean for our future? A special thanks to Lumo Coffee for sponsoring this episode. This top quality organic coffee from the highlands of Peru is rich in antioxidants. Economics Explorer listeners can enjoy a 10% discount. Details are in the show notes. Now, let's jump into the episode. I hope you enjoy it. And as this is the Australian Taxpayers Alliance live stream, we keep an especially close eye on the tax data, and the ABS released their annual compendium of the state and Commonwealth government tax data. And we see that for the first time, we've got, well, in the data set they've got back to, back the last 10 years, we've got, and I imagine this is probably an historic high because, government just keeps growing larger. It's crossed 30% of GDP. So that's tax. That's before royalties and earnings of government-owned corporations, and that pushes if you take all of that into account and the deficits that we're running, that's got to fund a government sector of around 39% of GDP. I think Rob Carlin's figures have it getting up to that. So we've got government to GDP in the sort of high 30s. We've got tax to GDP crossing 30%. And burden of government just keeps growing. And this is obviously a concern for us because we know that the quality of a lot of that spending is not particularly good. And, full credit, Labor, I think, has finally realised what a, millstone or albatross the NDIS is. And, they're saying the right things. We've just got to see if they've got the follow through. But I liked what was it Mark Butler, what he had to say, and it looks like they get it. And we just need to see what that follow through looks like. The final thing I want to cover, something we talk about a lot, John, is this off budget spending, the all of the tens of billions of dollars that goes out of the budget in the in investment in financial assets for policy purposes, the off-budget spending. We see just what poor value for money much of this is, where we see that of the Reconstruction Fund, a significant proportion of the money that they're doling out, so $6 billion of it, which has been diverted to net zero initiatives, and renewables, that's essentially earning less than the cost of borrowing. So they're losing money on that. So the rate of return they're getting on that is not enough to make up for the borrowing cost. So just not very good investment at all. So a very big fiscal risk there, as we would have predicted. So, John, that's enough from me for the moment. Any thoughts or comments, or Sync, anything, any comments from you, any thoughts, any questions?
Just a quick comment on the last point before Sinks does all the heavy lifting, just so that people at home are aware of this. This fund, the National Reconstruction Fund, as it hands out money and receives less than the rate of interest they're paying to borrow the money they're going to hand out, they're losing money for the government. They're losing money for the taxpayer. It won't be in the budget bottom line. Right. This will all happen off budget. You will not see this impacting the budget bottom line when they announce it on the second Tuesday of May. And that's the point we make about how these, all of these, basically government banks, especially, but also government-run businesses, are a way for them to get up to all manner of shenanigans and have most people not notice them. Thankfully, here, who's the author? Ronald Mizzen. Well, he's brought some
he's one of the
attention to
AFR journalists. Yeah.
It won't be in the budget bottom line. And so realistically, the government spends a lot of time caring about that, their underlying cash balance, which is the main thing that's reported. Anything not in the underlying cash balance, they basically have the political attitude that they can screw up the finances, but if it's not in the underlying cash balance, they can get away with it. And politically, realistically, that seems to be true. They can get away with it. So.
Well, this is why Chris Richardson's saying now we should go back to looking at the headline cash balance, because that does have all of that off-budget spending in it. And we've seen that big divergence opening up between the headline cash balance and the underlying cash balance. So Chris Richardson's saying, yeah, maybe we should go back to focusing on that.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I don't think headline cash balance includes everything either, does it?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of the stuff that the government spends on investment doesn't actually appear. The way in which you should actually keep track of what's really happening is to actually have a look at the growth in national debt, because you've got to borrow the money. So the growth in national debt is actually telling you what's happening to the underlying figures. So the government claims to have a surplus, and yet national debt's gone up. Well, they don't really have a surplus. That's that's the bottom line. And another argument that I like to say to people very often is that if the private sector ran their books, their accounting systems, and reported in the same way the federal government did, people would go to jail. And I actually kind of think that there does need to be some after the fact settling up. Our political system more or less works on the bourgeois tendencies of the middle class. So if we are totally scandalized and we throw the government out, that's supposed to be punishment enough for what they've done wrong. Whereas in actual fact, they engage in what politely is called fiscal illusion, where they mislead and obfuscate, knowing full well that most people, they don't really understand, they don't really care enough, and then all of a sudden we get hit with these massive economic shocks, and the population are saying, gee, what's happening here? That's been happening for the last while. The last, let's say, honest people, or reasonably honest people, I have criticisms of Mr. Costello too, but the last reasonably honest people in power were Howard and Costello, where they actually tried to not engage in a lot of these shenanigans. The big shenanigan that they pulled off, of course, was to claim that the GST was a state tax and not a federal tax because the states were getting the money. So they didn't include the GST in their tax statistics, which, to their credit, when Labor came to power, they just reversed all that and put it back in again. But nonetheless, we've seen the kind of silliness. The NBN, for example, must be one of the biggest schmozzles known to man, is not on on the budget at all, and it definitely should be, because they're never going to make that money back. So keep an eye on the debt situation. That will tell you if government's having to borrow money and borrow more and more money. $1.6 trillion.
That's with the states. Yeah,
Yes.
that's the federal government and states. Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say, like,
you got to add those guys back in as well.
Yes. Yeah.
This is obfuscated by a bunch of things. So a few comments here, if you'll indulge me. Firstly, just measuring the budget balance. Like you pick up a newspaper, it'll say deficit 20 billion, whatever it says, right? They'll be talking about the underlying cash balance. There is also the operating balance, the net operating balance, the underlying cash balance, the headline cash balance, the fiscal balance, the impact on debt, as Sinclair was saying. There's all of these different balances. And it can be quite tricky to work out the right one and work out when to use each one. For instance, I just double checked there. The headline cash balance, it includes changes to your net financial position for policy reasons, but not for
Yes.
non-policy reasons. So if you just make a loss, if you've got a government-owned business that makes a loss, your net debt goes up, right? Your financial position goes down, doesn't show up in the headline cash balance either. So it gets painfully complex, and the complexity of it allows unscrupulous actors to be able to drive a truck through. Just one quick note on that. To his credit, Costello introduced a consistent budget reporting framework.
Yes.
Before that, people had changed it around every time they got in. Now, realistically, what that's ended up being is a one statement in the budget that no one reads, but it is there, right? So weirdos and nerds like me can go and read it and untangle a lot of this data, but that's not what's actually reported in budget statement 3, which is, or on the summary that they give to the journalists. The journalists can't read a budget paper, right? So they read the summary. So you still get a bit of the games, but to his credit, Costello did add a requirement to have that. I think it's budget statement 7 or whatever it is. But one more thing, sorry, long rant. Sinclair says quite wisely, so look at the impact on debt. Which debt? There are just as many different measures of financial health of the state. So you've got gross debt, you've got net debt. That I don't think either of those are the correct one. I think net financial worth is the correct metric to look at, but you've also got net financial liabilities to look at. And then you've got to decide whether you factor in the state and local situation, which I would argue we do, because if any state goes bankrupt, clearly the feds are bailing them out, right? So if you want to look at the point at which we are getting close to a fiscal cliff, you need to factor in those dodgy state debts too. So
do you know how hard it is to explain to a journalist that if a state goes broke, that the feds will have to bail them out? They'll say, oh, no, completely different thing and what have you. You say, are you nuts? Obviously, the feds are going to be bailing them out. But just before you carry on with your rant, just to get in a word in, my favorite number is the face value of the gross debt. That is how much has to get paid back.
But we do have financial assets as well, though. I mean, to the degree that we've got financial assets that are basically being held with the explicit purpose of being able to pay off future debts.
The only financial asset the Commonwealth government really has is the future fund. And that's already spoken for by superannuation debt of the Commonwealth government. The other financial assets they have are sillinesses that are carried at director valuations, and of course those directors are never going to go to jail. So I'm always underwhelmed by the argument we have got financial assets. Okay, we've got some gold in the mint somewhere. We've got bits and bobs. We could flog off the ABC for $1 billion or less. At the end of the day, the only thing that they've got is the ability to extract our money from us at gunpoint. That is the Commonwealth government's greatest asset.
Well, then you should be going further and those liabilities, because that gross debt is normally, if you're referring to gross debt, maybe you weren't. But gross debt is only the actual treasury papers. The government owes more than that. That doesn't include our super liabilities and various other things as well. So whatever number you think you have, add 300 billion to it.
Oh, yeah, well, I think you're backing Sink's point, aren't you, John? Because Sink was saying that super liability offsets the assets that you were talking about. So therefore,
don't give me that. That's political spin. That's like saying the Medicare levy goes to Medicare, right? I mean, we all know the future funds just goes into a big bucket of money, and so I'm saying include both, right?
Yeah,
but they're not actually linked to each other. The size of the future fund is not linked to the size of our superannuation liabilities.
No, it's not our superannuation liabilities. It's those fat cats in Canberra's superannuation liabilities.
The government superannuation liabilities.
My super is not tied to the future fund. I wish it was, because if anything happened to my particular super fund, they're just going to let it fail. Whereas anything happens to the fat cats, bureaucrat politician super fund, it's getting bailed out. You know.
Right, so moot point, Sinclair. We'll never be allowed to retire. We'll be doing this for the rest of our life.
Aren't you a member of that fat cat super fund that Sinclair's talking about, John? I'm still
you,
PSS, I
you
think.
know that because you are as well, Gene. But yeah,
Yes.
just to clarify though,
Oh, so
the
I'm up with 2 parasites. What's this?
But just to be clear, that again, it's not linked to the future fund at all. The reason it's
No,
it is not.
linked to
Yeah.
No,
it's
it is.
linked to the
Yes.
government's ability to point a gun at your face and say, "Give me your money," and that's
Yes.
a power
That's
that
not
most
nothing.
financial markets. Yeah, but financial markets put the lowest risk premium on that, right? I mean, that's why it's the
Yeah,
lowest interest rate
absolutely.
the government can
So
borrow.
whenever I hear the story, we've got AAA rating and what have you, they just know we are unarmed and the government can stick a gun to our head and say, "Give us your money." That's what the
Which
AAA
makes it
rating is measuring.
which makes it remarkable that we don't always have the AAA rating because I guess they are aware of the fact that eventually they can hit a Laffer maximum and start squeezing that goose too hard and just literally
Yes.
not be able to raise the money.
Yes, yes, yes. But nonetheless, it's that is a very powerful incentive. But the states can definitely go broke, and I wouldn't be surprised. Oh, I mean, I kind of know the Northern Territory is broke, but they're not a state. I have views there. I kind of think the federal government has absconded from its responsibilities because the Northern Territory is not a state.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
So they're in a different situation to say Victoria, where effectively we are broke.
Yeah, just on the point about whether the feds would bail them out, I think in an extreme situation, yes, I agree. But I think you'd see the states having to do the heavy lifting first, wouldn't you? Like Kennett did in Victoria in the 90s, like they must have done in South Australia after the SA Bank collapse. So I think the states will have to inflict a lot of pain on their taxpayers to try and get them out of the situation before the feds
They
step in.
They
Yeah.
will, but if you also remember back to the 1990s, Kennett had stuff to sell. So in addition to putting on household levies and all this sort of stuff, they were able to privatize a whole bunch of stuff.
Yep.
We don't have too much to privatize anymore. Now, the whole argument was that if you sold off the crown jewels, future governments would have to be more responsible because they would have to pay it back.
Yeah.
That actually hasn't happened as we had hoped.
Yeah.
It is problematic. The other thing that has happened that is more worrying is that for a long, long time, Australians used to be very economically literate. We used to worry about when government started spending money, we used to worry who's going to pay for it, how's it going to get paid, where's the money coming from. If you have a look at modern debates nowadays, nobody ever asks that question because we all know where the money's coming from, the bond market. We're just going to
I
borrow.
don't know
And
that, Sinks. They definitely don't know that.
we are just borrowing and borrowing like there's no tomorrow. And we've also lost the whole idea where government spending is now called investment. Um,
Mm.
uh, that happened under Wayne Swan, and nobody ever pulled him up on it. Well, no, not nobody, but he got away with it, and now they all get away with it. It is very problematic.
Yeah, they have co-opted some of the righteous words of economics that were supposed to be our
Yes,
domain. They've co-opted the word without co-opting the meaning, which makes it even
yes,
harder for us to actually say what we're trying to say. Two quick points here. To some degree, this is commentary about how we think politics works. I tend to think Sinks's interpretation is correct, but it's contested in both senses. Would the feds step in? They don't literally have to. They could just have the states go through a lot of pain.
Yeah.
But the issue is, look, depending on what is the political party in power federally and at the state level, could impact how that plays out. But if it was a sympathetic government at the federal level and the state level, once that government at the state level was starting to cause so much pain they were going to lose the next election, I think politically the feds are going to step in. So that's one point there. In terms of economic literacy, I got a slightly different take to you there, Sinks. I don't think there was ever very much economic literacy. We've just changed our economic instincts. And I don't think these instincts came from deep learning. But people used to have this knee-jerk reaction of voting the bastard out if they ran too many deficits, like getting angry at debt and deficits. Those used to be F words, not D words. And I think to some degree, people's instinctive antipathy to those debt and deficit, to the D words, didn't come from deep learning. And to some degree, it was a knee-jerk reaction that wasn't quite technically correct. You could have some amount of useful debt in some situations, and they were just doing this sort of blanket rule. And so very sophisticated wankers showed up and said, "Oh, no, you're being too unsophisticated. You could have good debt." Now, their argument is true, but it's irrelevant because I don't think voters are ever going to have a sophisticated understanding of the nuances. They're going to have instincts. and their instinct against debt and deficit was a good thing for our country. So it wasn't technically correct in every instance, but it was a good instinct to have. And when they had that instinct, our political system worked better, and they've lost that. I don't think there is a political instinct now that says, oh no, if I have another deficit or the debt goes up, I'm going to lose some points in the next poll. No one thinks that anymore. We're now in the Dick Cheney period of Australian politics where they say debt doesn't matter. And I think it's reached Australia, unfortunately. And I think both sides of politics are starting to realize it, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, it's what James M. Buchanan called the old-time fiscal religion, is that people had a dislike of debt and deficit. Now, this, as you say, this is a good thing. And that's what I kind of think of as being relatively economically literate, because the old-time fiscal religion got lost in, say, the United States, the United Kingdom, Western Europe, sometime in the 1980s. We've only lost this in the 2000s to the noughties, the 2010s.
You're getting some love in the chat there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Exactly.
And so is
John,
Wayne Swan here. Wayne Swan, the universe's greatest treasurer. Oh, there you go.
I think that was, I think that's sarcasm. John, can I just comment? Like, you were questioning whether the Australian public, the level of literacy, I think it was much higher in the 80s. Like, I remember, I mean, maybe just because I'm a few years older than you. I mean, partly that was because of, I think Keating was a very good communicator of economic issues. And I distinctly remember, I mean, there was that time when he hopped on, was it 7:30 or one of the shows, and actually explained the J curve with the exchange rate and how what would happen is the current account would first worsen because of the price impact, because that would immediately impact, and you'd have to pay more for your imports, but then eventually, because of what would happen, we'd be more competitive with our exports, and imports would be more expensive, the current account would improve. And people got it. It was quite extraordinary. And I think, and people were talking about it in the community. And, Keating said that every galah and every pet shop's talking about microeconomic reform. So I think we did have a time in our history when we were more economically literate than we are now, or at least the average voter was.
Yeah.
I remain skeptical. I think we've always got a bias towards idealizing the past, and I suspect to some degree what happened is that the dumber echelons of society had literally no microphone back then. So now we hear them a lot more. The dumber echelons are certainly louder.
They run
I don't know if
YouTube
they
shows at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night.
Yes. I don't know if we've got dumber or dumber people have just got better access to communications now. So
Can we come back to the debt? Let me put up an extreme hypothetical. What would happen if we had a state government in Australia suddenly say, we are broke, we can't squeeze any more money out of our taxpayers, and if the feds don't come to our aid, we are going to default on our debt? I don't think people have given that serious thought, because the only ever time in Australian history that somebody threatened to default, the state governor immediately fired the premier and said, that's a stupid thing to even say. But I could imagine we could be in a situation where a state government or a party running for office could actually say, well, those international financiers, they were irresponsible to lend us all this money, and we are just going to say, screw it, we're not paying you back. That would be catastrophic, I would have thought, on all sorts of levels. So we kind of know, I think, at that point, the feds are going to step in. Now, how they step in might vary from government to government, and I suspect the way they would do it is they would play silly buggers with the GST and kind of hide it and massage it in that particular way. I think that's what would happen. I also think that would be a huge wake-up call for the Australian population, because I think our general population, their instinct would come back. They would be appalled by the idea that we would renege on a debt. Even though everybody else in the non-English speaking world does this on a regular basis, we would be appalled by this. And unfortunately, one of my other theories is you can't explain bad government to people. They have to experience it.
Yeah.
And I think we might be heading to a situation whereby a state government could hit the wall. And then all of a sudden, people are going to wake up and say, oh my God, how did this happen?
That's the
Look,
Argentina theory, where you can only have Javier Milei after you've had a bunch of Peronists first. So.
look, I think where that risk is real is if we have another financial crisis. I think outside of that, I mean, the state governments, I think, can service their debt, but they will have to either cut services or increase taxes to be able to pay for it. I don't see any problem, any risk of default at the moment. But in a financial crisis, if there's a rerun of 2008, then certainly. So in 2008, in '09, the federal government did guarantee some of the state borrowing because the state governments were concerned and they were coming to us in Treasury. Like, I remember meetings where senior people from Queensland Treasury like Gary Ward and Stephen Rochester from QTC would come in and say, look, can you guys borrow on our behalf, or could you provide your AAA stamp on our debt? And then eventually the federal government did that because they were very concerned about because they're a subnational government, they've got less visibility or less prestige or cachet on the international stage than the national government. And so in a financial crisis, they could be at risk of, not getting the funding that they need.
Mm.
So I'm gonna disagree with both of you, which makes it always much more fun. Like, your point there, Gene, about it requiring a crisis. Look, a crisis is going to come along eventually, especially with the way our leaders currently running the world. But even without a crisis, we have an aging population, and the states are required to pay for healthcare. Now, if they try to cut back on healthcare, in most states, there's an upper house with a bunch of recalcitrant state senators who will probably block any halfway sensible reform. So that's probably literally not going to be possible politically. There's very limited revenue heads, types of tax that the state governments can control. Most states now get most of their revenue from pocket money from Papa Canberra, right? Which is not a very good way to encourage responsible state behavior. They've got stamp duties. A lot of those are already way too high. They got payroll tax. It's going to be hard to squeeze much more out of that, given how high the tax rates already are in other areas. There's limited ability to raise tax. And again, their upper houses may not let them. Just that the natural low rate of growth of their tax heads, the tax types in the state level, with a high rate of growth of their health spending, and their lack of control over at least half their budget, makes it quite easy for me to believe that they will just sleepwalk to a debt crisis. And it's quite easy for me to believe those upper houses will just prevent difficult libertarian reforms. And then presto, you've got the collapse. Although now I'll just disagree. I'll just disagree with you as well.
Increasing taxation is not a libertarian policy ever, John.
No, I'm saying to cut back on the spending, right? So they might be able to find someone to help them increase tax a bit. But I suspect they'll be running out of extra revenue from the tax increases because they'll be getting close to Laffer maximums on a lot of those taxes anyway. If they want to cut spending, that could work. Yeah. But without a libertarian control of the upper house of the state governments, they're going to struggle to pass that legislation as well. But where I'll disagree with Sinks is I think the obvious way they'll do the bailout is an IMF-style loan. We'll give you the money, but we will tell you have to do X, Y, Z. And if you don't do X, Y, Z, and that's what that's basically going to do is undermine our federalism. So that's a big coming challenge. Although I'll push back in another way. There is an upside to default. Yes, I agree with me too. I disagree with me too.
I think our federalism is a ship that sailed a long time ago.
Yeah, well, that's why we should abolish the federal income tax, and then we could get federalism back. But that's not the point.
Federal governments. What's wrong with you, John? Abolish the federal government.
Step by step. Okay, but anyway, the point you make about default. I don't know if I've put this out into a public domain before, so I could get in trouble if you guys have good responses here. But if they default, that means people will refuse to lend them money, and they have to live within their means. Good. I want to discourage people from lending money to governments. I want to punish people who buy bonds from governments. I want them to have a high risk premium so that governments have to think twice about borrowing, and maybe they can't borrow. And then if they can't borrow, all they can literally do at a state level, they can't print money. All they can literally do is live within their means. The end. Good.
Yeah.
I have fantasized about this quite too. And I just love the idea that you just say, okay, we're not going to borrow more money and we're happy with that. That's not the international experience, though. If you have a look at the history of defaults, markets just keep lending money again and again and again to the same recalcitrants. all the time. So, yes, I would love the situation. You come to power and you say, well, we don't want your money ever again. We're going to default on you guys. But you just know the next couple of years, they'll be back again to lend you the money. Yes, I love the idea.
But and then again,
I
that
just
kind
don't
of
know if it's going to work.
then the vindictiveness in me wants those people to lose their money, right? If there's people out there continually lending money to governments when they shouldn't, then why are we crying crocodile tears when those people lose their money? Screw them. I'd prefer them to lose their money than me to suffer inflation.
Yes,
So,
yes, no. So I'm not opposed to this. I just don't know. We have tried everything. We've tried starving the beast. We've tried
Yeah.
all these different things. My new one thing is, well, the end of the Monty Python movie where he has a wafer thin chocolate. Now I'm kind of thinking if we overfeed the beast and it blows up by itself, that actually might be a way to do things. But at the end of the day, the ability of governments to actually either raise tax revenue or borrow money or what have you is so astonishing that they just get away with it at every particular margin. We're
Yeah.
always on a hiding to nothing until we can actually convince people that taxing money to spend on negative net present value projects is a bad idea. We don't tax ourselves into prosperity. Sure, there are some things that we do need to spend money on, national security, prisons, law and order. Okay, these are minimalist things. But almost everything else, at some point, you say, do we really need that? And we need to be able to have this conversation without people saying, you're a Grinch who hates the poor. Because that is the argument that we are at now.
whereas
Yeah.
in reality, we hate everyone equally because equal opportunity, evil fascist. Well, no, I've got one comment for you here. Sinks Ryan is agreeing with you fully, and in the WA perspective, calling for WA to secede. Although I imagine
Yes.
you'll now call him a communist for not wanting
No,
the WA government to also be shut down.
I am a huge, huge fan of secession. I always think we should secede. People should always go. Now, the problem with the Western Australians is that they're so slack. So they can secede from the rest of the Commonwealth more or less by just saying they want to go. And in the 1930s, they did say they wanted to go and then didn't get their act together and ended up not leaving. So I always love chatting with Western Australians because, you say, you guys take too much of the GST, blah, blah, blah. And then they say, we will secede. I'll say, well, guys, go, we support you going. You would be better off seceding. People here in Victoria and New South Wales, we'd be better off too if Western Australia seceded. So maybe not South Australia, Tasmania and Queensland.
I was going to say the same. Yeah.
Okay. But so they're not going to be better off, but I'm going to be better off. You're going to be better off. This is a Pareto optimal solution to this particular.
Well, let me say as well, I think South Australia and Tasmania in the long run would be better off not being welfare bludgers, right? They would have to learn to actually introduce policies that improve their own productivity or be happy being poor. They have two choices.
To be fair to the South Australians, they have got a ton of uranium. Let me rephrase that. They have many, many, many tons of uranium. They are the Saudi Arabia of the world for uranium. And if they would love to dig it up and sell it on the world markets, and it's the rest of us that are stopping them. So the South Australians are sitting on, I would say, a gold mine. They're sitting on a uranium mine. They would be huge. And of course, the counter argument to them selling the uranium is people will say, oh, but if we sold it, we'd have to take it back. Do you know what a fantastic business that would be? We take back spent uranium and bury it in the Western Australian or the South Australian desert where nobody lives. It's geologically stable. You drill a hole into the ground, you drop the waste into it, and you charge people money for the next 50,000 years to look after their nuclear waste. So if we would actually just open our eyes to nuclear, South Australia would become rich overnight, and they would be making a ton of money selling the stuff and then storing the spent stuff. So it's actually the rest of us, to a large extent, who are keeping the South Australians poor. The Tasmanians have got no excuse.
There's an easy sell.
The Tasmanians are just too small to be a viable state in and of themselves. I would love to say they should join up with Victoria, but we don't want them because they've got no money. But definitely, they should.
What a glorious day, Sinks. This is a glorious day where I get to accuse accuse you of being the communist if you think that state is too small. I mean, the states need to shrink all the way down to the household, surely. If you actually want the free market.
Well, you were the person telling me just a few minutes ago, baby steps. The first baby step, the first baby step is we get rid of the Commonwealth government, Canberra. It's a foreign colonial power that sort of tells the rest of us what to do. Sorry, Gene, do you live in Canberra? But anyway,
No, I'm in Brisbane.
good. Oh, excellent. So we'd get rid of Canberra because more or less it's like a foreign colonial power telling the rest of us what to do and how to live our lives. So I would start off by getting rid of the Commonwealth government, have a free trade agreement with all the other states and territories. That would be the first step. And then have policy experimentation. And then maybe if we think Queensland's too big, we chop it in half or whatever the case may be. But certainly the current colonial configuration that was efficient for a 19th century economy with 19th century transport costs and 19th century communication costs is not viable for what we want for ourselves today.
Yeah, well, my version of a similar argument is take away all of the coercive taxing powers from the federal government. They can continue to pretend they exist, but only on donations from the states, and then have 30 states instead of 6. And then we would have a more vibrant jurisdictional competition, in my opinion. I think it would be easier to achieve if we let them pretend they still existed with donations, because then all the people that really think it matters, a defense force or something, can sleep tight and let us get away with the rest. Inshallah.
Yep. But anyway, so the important point of your story is that the states lost the Second World War. Because before the Second World War, the states had income tax powers.
Yeah.
And we should actually go back to that situation because the problem that we have, as you were saying before, is that the states have got all the spending and they can't match their taxing powers with their spending. So it pays them to spend more because it doesn't cost them on the income tax side because they know they can always run to Canberra with sob stories and they will get the money somehow or the other. So you actually need to have some fiscal discipline that the same people who spend the money have to tax the money. And that's what we lost in Australia in the Second World War. But because we had that old-time fiscal religion, we didn't notice it was too much of a problem until the last 20 years or so. And then all of a sudden, we've moved away from having, economically literate, responsible people, dare I say, Paul Keating, Peter Costello, people like that, men of substance, who could actually explain things to the world, to the Congo line of numpties we've had since 2007. They've all been, each one, just when you think it can't get any worse. No, they dig deep and come up with another bunch of numpties with stupid ideas. Dear God.
So there is something to be said for the fact that the iPhone came out in 2007, right? So the people have embraced a different type of communication that seems to have dumbed us down, decreased our attention span, and allowed everyone to get involved in this ridiculously dumbed down debate. I'd been told for years that when we used to talk economics, sinks, we used to pontificate with lots of big words, and many people would say, look, you really need to dumb it down. I got to say, after the last 2 decades, I reckon we've achieved that. I reckon it is well and truly dumbed down now, and maybe we need to start going back the other way. The dumbing has been achieved. But anyway, Gene, you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, at least Malcolm Turnbull did propose giving some of the income tax powers back to the states, but that was knocked back pretty quickly. I think Anastasia Palaszczuk from Queensland led the pushback, saying, well, we're happy with the current situation for the reasons you mentioned.
Of course, but the states are always going to be happy with it. I mean, the federal government can do it without asking the states, right? All they need to do is the states are allowed to have an income tax. The reason they don't is the federal government currently says we will give you billions of dollars of free money if you don't have a state income tax. So all the federal government needs to do is say, you can have a state income tax if you want now, and we're not giving you the billions of money. And if you like, we'll even help you coordinate the raising of it. But we're not giving you money for free. So you either say you've got a state income tax or just cut your budget. Those are your 2 options. The federal government can do that. The states will never call for it. I would love to see some good people get into state government and actually call for that. But you're far more likely to get that from the federal Senate. That's the only place I've ever heard sensible calls.
Right.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull that policy of the states would get back their taxing powers lasted for 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was so bitterly disappointed because I had high hopes for Malcolm Turnbull. He's a smart guy, and yet just didn't seem to achieve anything. Sort of folded at the first sign of grape shot. Even if he was not going to go through, he could have humiliated the state governments for weeks.
Yeah.
Making them
Yeah.
beg and plead and carry on that they didn't want this. But no, at the first sign of trouble, he said, "Oh no, 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 terrible."
Yeah, it
Just
wasn't
thinking
blocked. He
out.
go forward with the idea. Someone should go forward with the idea and lose if they're going to lose, or win if they can. And unfortunately, with Turnbull, because I think you're right, there was hope for Turnbull, and he's great on some issues and
Yeah.
terrible on others. And he chose to use all his political capital basically on climate boondoggles
Yeah.
and other stupid shit fuckery. If he just focused on cutting corporate income tax and introducing school vouchers, both of which I believe he at least used to believe in, he might have been a very different prime minister.
And we also know his economics team. I mean, those are all smart guys.
Mm.
Yeah, Alex.
And
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, and Paul, they were all really smart guys. They must have been pulling their hair out because they would say to Malcolm, "We're going to do this." He'd say, "Fantastic," and the first sign of trouble was, "Oh, no, no, no." Yeah, so it's he had a fantastic team.
Just
Yeah.
responding to Lyndon, yeah, it's been suggested a few times. The states don't want it because think of it from the states' perspective. If they had control over their own taxing powers,
They'd have to
if they
work.
wanted to raise money, they would have to go to the public and say, "I'm raising your taxes now," which is a
Yeah.
much harder thing for a politician to do. Instead, they can say, "It's not my fault. It's the federal government. Can I have more pocket money, please?" That's why I refer to it as they all live off pocket money from Papa Canberra. And the way to make more money when you live off pocket money is to go to your authority figure and say, "Can I please have more pocket money?" And that's basically the revenue strategy of most of our states, all of our states to some degree. So the states will never want it, but they don't have to have a say in the matter, right? I mean, the federal government doesn't have to keep handing them those grants, and the federal government doesn't have to continue banning state income taxes. They could just act, and the states would have to fall in line.
Mm.
Anyway, we've gone on for 50 minutes riffing off what you gave us there, Gene. So thank you. Look, the topic I did want to get into today, and well, don't know how much time we'll have for all of it, but the upcoming budget, there is already starting to be a bunch of leaks coming out of the government about what they may be doing. I think perhaps they had started talking and leaking about changing capital gains tax quite a while ago, and that topic has been ventilated quite a lot, I think, over the last couple of elections, indeed. And we could go back into that, especially if Sinks wants to add anything to that conversation. But the two things that have shown up more recently in the budget debate has been this consideration of a gas export tax and the fact that the government, to their credit, seems to be at least taking some tepid steps towards getting NDIS spending under control, including, importantly, admitting that the structure is wrong. And I'll just give a little rant on NDIS and then throw to you guys to do anything you like on the budget. But I'd been somewhat happy that both sides of government had been admitting that NDIS spending was unsustainable. I was worried that they were going to say, therefore, we need to crack down on the bikie gangs. And of course, of course, you need to, because the bikie gangs are running some rorts through the NDIS system.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, there is some criminal
Yeah.
element involved, but
Oh,
that
yes.
to me seemed like an easy cop out that wasn't going to really solve the problem. I mean, you might save $1 billion, but when the spending is increasing by $5-10 billion per year, that's the increase each year. Uh,
Yeah.
that was going to be a rounding error. And my concern was they weren't going to address the fundamental incentive problems you have of if you tell a bunch of parents that you can have thousands of dollars of free money as long as you discover, little Johnny has some sort of mental health problem, suddenly a lot of little Johnnies are getting mental health problems. And who would have thought incentives change behavior? I don't believe that 1 in 5 of all boys in this country have suddenly come down with mental health problems. I believe that 1 in 5 parents of little boys have worked out that they can get paid for saying such. And there is some addressing of the incentives, and it looks like they are going to take some steps to address the incentives. Unless that is done, this is not a solvable problem. So, Gene, you were going to
Yeah.
say?
Or maybe this has been pedantic, but I'm not sure it's 1 in 5, is it?
It's 1 in
Maybe
5.
it's 1 in
Of
5,
boys,
is
right?
it?
1 in 5
Of
boys.
everyone. Not of
1 in
everyone, not of all children, but of boys, 1 in 5, because one of the things you can get funded for is if your boy doesn't like sitting still for long periods of time.
Right. Okay. I didn't realize it was that high. I'd heard a figure like something like 1 in 7 or 1 in 8, but 1 in 5. Okay. Incredible.
That might be total children.
I think it's school age boys or primary school age boys or something along those lines.
Right.
It's one in 5 is the number. Okay, so are you going to rant first, Gene, or am I going to rant first?
Oh, you ran. You go.
Okay, all right. So the problem with the NDIS, it was a rort from the very beginning, because we were told at the time that Australia makes no provision for disabled people, which is simply not true. It's a bald-faced lie. What was happening is maybe Australia didn't, but the Australian states did. So each state and territory had its own disability program, and it was run at the state level. And the one thing we do know about states is they are pretty good at service delivery because that's their bread and butter. The other thing that we know is the Commonwealth government is rubbish at service delivery because that is not their bread and butter. So that's not what they do. So we came along, we had this idea that all of a sudden Australia is not doing anything about disability services, which is simply not true. We were, but there wasn't a national uniform approach because, surprise, we're a federation. We're not supposed to have national approaches. Okay, so that was the first thing. The next thing that happened was the NDIS was going to be an industry support scheme. That's what it really was. They had this idea that we were going to have entrepreneurs starting up companies that would be making hospital beds and wheelchairs and medical equipment for disabled people. Now, let's also physically disabled people. That was the idea. So this was actually a manufacturing industry support scheme was the idea. Okay. And the feds were going to pump in all this money on top of the state money that was already going in. Of course, the states very quickly realized, well, gee, if the feds are pumping in money, we can take our money out. Okay. And then the next thing that happened was kids or parents of kids who did not have physical disabilities but have mental disabilities thought they were being left out. So they went to the courts. And the courts ruled reasonably enough that a mental disability can be as debilitating as a physical disability, which I think is probably true. And so they had to be included. Now we end up with a situation whereby, as John was saying, if you can get some doctor, you go doctor hopping, and you get some doctor to diagnose your kid being on the spectrum or something other as like this, you can get money for them. The state school system worked out that they could get extra teachers. Now, if you say to me there's a person who's rorting the government out of money because there's a perverse incentive, I can say, well, it's disgusting, but I understand this is how the world works. We now have the situation where the state governments are rorting the federal government out of money, which I think, gee, that's a little bit beyond the pale. That's actually quite shocking, really. So the whole scheme has turned out to be completely different from what was promised for reasons completely utter than what was promised. And I don't remember, John, in the bad old days when the Abbott government came to power, I was saying then, we can't afford the NDIS. In those days, it was not even anywhere near the numbers or the growth we've seen now. I was saying at the time, we can't afford the NDIS, we can't afford the NBN, we should shut them down until we can afford them and then go forward. Well, fast forward, 15 years or so, and it's a total schmozzle. We are spending more on kids on the spectrum than we're spending on national defense, which is a strange thing. Federal government shouldn't be spending any money on disabilities. This is genuinely a state government function.
Can I add?
So we have this complete schmozzle, and well, I'll come back to the budget after you've had your rant, Gene. Sorry.
Just one quick comment on that. If there has been this massive spike in autism, we should see that showing up in a massive spike for the vote for the Libertarian Party.
Sean.
Look, I don't want to comment on who your voters are, but okay.
Sean. Can I just co-sign, or I fully agree with what Sinclair's saying. I think NDIS is an example of a government program, which it's far outgrown what the original idea was or the original goal was. Before I went to Federal Treasury, I was involved in workplace health and safety and workers' compensation policy in Queensland, and we were talking with the other states and about what eventually led to the NDIS. What was originally seen as the policy failure was the fact that you could have a catastrophic accident and wouldn't be covered by insurance. You'd fall through the cracks. Say you were diving at a creek and you ended up a quadriplegic. Well, and you can't necessarily sue anyone, and you're not covered by insurance. So there were people who were really buggered because they would have a very serious accident, life-changing accident, quadriplegic, and there's very little money to look after them. And so that was what was originally seen as the policy failure. I mean, that Sinclair's right. There were existing supports. Maybe you can argue that it wasn't sufficient and NDIS is more generous. But look, I mean, there's scarcity, right? We've got scarcity of resources. We need to allocate them in a way that makes sense. But yes, the original policy failure was to help out the people who were catastrophically injured and weren't covered by insurance. They sort of fell through the cracks, and yet it's morphed into this $50 billion scheme. It's just quite extraordinary what's happened. I've just been blown away by it.
Yeah, it's positive to see that nearly everyone now, including the mainstream hacks, are admitting that something needs to be done. Uh,
Mm.
And look, we'll see what's actually proposed and how effective it is, but it seems like they're trying to carve off uh, more of these non-acute conditions getting into the system, talking about potentially bringing down the number of people who are eligible. But I got to say, both of you guys, in talking about this, have suggested an alternative path that we could have gone down. So there's 3 alternative paths we could have gone down. We could have just listened to Sinks and abolished government. But if that wasn't going to be the path, then if the states were already doing it and the concern was there was not enough money, block grants to the states. I mean, ideally, give the states back their taxing powers, as we discussed before. But if we're just trying to isolate each issue, one on their own, if the issue was insufficient money, the states already had a system, block grants to the states, and the states continue with their system. So that would have been a more obvious, direct solution. The downside to that is the federal politicians can't take credit and get reelected by campaigning on "look what I've done." The other potential solution here, and this goes from what you were saying, Gene, you pointed out a potential issue. Some people, you could argue what you described was a situation of some people being underinsured. If
Yes.
that was to solve a problem, you first have to correctly identify it. If that's the correct identification of the problem, then they're governed. I don't want compulsory insurance, but a more direct thing to do there would be to have a national disability insurance scheme that is actually an insurance scheme instead of
Correct.
pretending it's an insurance scheme. I hate how they keep doing this. They keep bastardizing words so that no one knows what they mean. They
Yes.
could have just said, all right, here's a compulsory insurance scheme you have to have, everyone. It's $200 a year. I'm sorry, you have to pay that. If they want to be nice, they can then give us a $200 voucher, or I would suggest a $150 voucher so that people have skin in the game. And then you could have covered that gap in insurance. But instead, we've made this massive boondoggle where all of the incentives are, please go and spend more money. I mean, like you were saying or hinting at before, Sinks, I don't really blame the average punter rorting the system. The government created a system with incentives to be rorted. Fix the incentives. Don't blame the punter.
No, but I blame a lot of the dodgy providers. I mean, this is one of
They're
the
following their
problems, 'cause
incentives too.
the organised crime has figured out this is a good way to make money because you get this guaranteed income stream from the government.
But the whole problem is if you kind of think if criminals can work out how to rort systems, how stupid are the rest of us by just going along and actually saying, well, yeah, that's okay. But we see it everywhere. So we now hear criminals are rorting the NDIS, criminals are rorting the tobacco market. There's now stories that criminals are rorting the alcohol market. Is there anybody actually acting legally anymore? And this is the problem with the government because the more laws, the more crime, or the more fraud, or whatever it is, the more corruption that you have. Well, that's what we're seeing. I mean, we are legislated and regulated to within an inch of our lives, and yet we have these criminals running rampant in our society.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what people call
Does seem to
rorting
be
of the
strange.
NDIS, a lot of what people call rorting of the NDIS actually could kind of fit within the current rules. I mean, the rules are
Oh
so
yes.
stupid at the moment that you can follow the rules and really rort the system.
Yeah,
So yeah, we
yeah.
can find a few criminals, but if you crack down on the criminals, you have not fixed the system because you can
No.
exist within the rules in a ridiculous way, charging 300% markups, and it's within the rules.
Yes.
Okay, so that was our deep dive into government debt, what it really means, how it's measured, and how much we should worry about it. One of the best insights, in my view, from that conversation, it's from John, and it's one that I agree with, that the debt, at least in Australia, is not necessarily an immediate crisis, but it's a slow burning issue, and one that can become very serious if it's left unchecked. And to me, there was that really interesting question that was asked that came out of the conversation between Sinclair and John about our attitudes toward debt and the level of economic literacy. And it's this question of whether we've become too relaxed about deficits and debt. And my feeling is that we have, and the explosion or the huge growth in public debt that we've seen in Australia and other advanced economies, particularly since the financial crisis and then again since the pandemic, that is really evidence supporting that proposition. Okay, I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that the public debt is something that policymakers and voters should be paying more attention to? Please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. You can find my contact details in the show notes. Again, look, thanks for listening. I hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And until next time, goodbye.